In October 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than it ever had before. Two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, stood at the brink of disaster. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis, a tense 13-day standoff that shaped the course of history. To understand the Cuban Missile Crisis, we first need to look at the Cold War. After World War II, the world was divided into two main camps, the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union. This rivalry wasn't just about political ideologies, but also about military power, especially nuclear weapons. Both countries had developed nuclear weapons, and by the 1950s, the threat of a nuclear war was real. Each side built more and more missiles, fearing that the other would launch a surprise attack. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, the small island nation of Cuba was undergoing its own revolution. 1959, Fidel Castro and his supporters overthrew the Cuban government, establishing a communist regime just 90 miles from the United States. This was a big deal for the US. Having a communist country so close to home was seen as a threat. The US tried to stop Castro, even launching a failed invasion at the Bay of Pigs in 1961. But the invasion only pushed Castro closer to the Soviet Union. Soon, Cuba became a key ally for the Soviets in the Western Hemisphere. Everything changed in October 1962. US spy planes flying over Cuba took photos that revealed something alarming. The Soviets were secretly building nuclear missile sites on the island. These missiles could reach most of the United States in a matter of minutes. President John F. Kennedy was immediately briefed on the situation. The discovery of these missiles sparked a crisis that could lead to nuclear war. Kennedy and his advisors faced a difficult decision. They had to act quickly but carefully. Any wrong move could trigger a nuclear war. The president had a few options. He could bomb the missile sites, invade Cuba, or negotiate. But attacking Cuba might lead to a Soviet retaliation, possibly with nuclear weapons. On the other hand, doing nothing would allow the missiles to remain in Cuba, increasing the Soviet threat. In the end, Kennedy chose a middle path. He decided to impose a naval blockade around Cuba to stop more Soviet missiles from arriving. This was called a quarantine, since a blockade could be seen as an act of war. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy went on national television to announce the discovery of the missiles and the blockade. He warned that any missile launched from Cuba would be seen as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, and it would be met with a full-scale response. This was the moment when the world held its breath. For days, everyone feared that war could break out at any moment. As US ships enforced the blockade, Soviet ships headed toward Cuba. The question was, would the Soviets challenge the blockade, leading to a direct confrontation? The world waited anxiously. While the public feared the worst, behind the scenes, diplomatic efforts were underway. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev were secretly exchanging letters. Both leaders knew the stakes. Neither wanted nuclear war, but neither wanted to back down and appear weak. Over the next few days, the negotiations intensified. The Soviets insisted they had placed the missiles in Cuba for defensive purposes, to protect Cuba from another US's invasion. But the US was firm, the missiles had to go. After days of tension, a deal was finally struck on October 28, 1962. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a US promise not to invade the island. Additionally, the US secretly agreed to remove its own nuclear missiles from Turkey, which were close to the Soviet border. With this agreement, the Cuban Missile Crisis came to an end. The immediate danger of nuclear war was avoided, and both sides were able to step back from the brink of disaster. The Cuban Missile Crisis had lasting effects on both countries. It showed how close the world could come to nuclear war, and it also led to improved communication between the US and the Soviet Union. Shortly after the crisis, a direct hotline was set up between Washington and Moscow, so the leaders of both nations could communicate quickly in case of future crises. The crisis also had political consequences. Kennedy was praised for his handling of the situation, while Khrushchev faced criticism at home for backing down. But most importantly, the Cuban Missile Crisis served as a wake-up call for the world. It led to efforts to control the spread of nuclear weapons, including the signing of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains a powerful reminder of how dangerous nuclear weapons can be. It was a moment when the fate of the world hung in the balance, and through careful diplomacy and leadership, catastrophe was avoided. Today, the threat of nuclear war hasn't disappeared, but the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis continue to shape how countries approach nuclear diplomacy. It serves as a warning to future generations of what can happen when tensions between superpowers spiral out of control. Though the Cuban Missile Crisis was a terrifying moment in history, it also demonstrated the power of diplomacy and communication. In the end, both sides found a way to avoid disaster, and the world was spared from nuclear devastation. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below. What lessons do you think we can learn from the Cuban Missile Crisis today?